back. We started the last time I was here looking at James, the book of James, and we're going to fire right on with the next little bit of that book. And I'm going to start by reading the passage that I'm going to be having a think about today. And it says, "The brother in humble circumstances ought to take pride in his high position, but the one who is rich should take pride in his low position, because he will pass away like a wild flower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant, its blossom falls and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich man will fade away, even while he goes about his business. Blessed is the man who perseveres under trial, because when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life that God has promised to those who love him." So here we are again. James is saying it just as it is. He's not beating about the bush, and he's again saying these statements that are just so incredibly revolutionary. And I know I keep banging on about this, but Jesus was such a revolutionary person, and he came to turn everything that we think is the natural order of things on its head, and he came to turn things upside down. And it's like Jesus, I don't know, even us that have been around church for a long time probably think really Jesus was a really nice bloke, and he was. And he said some really lovely things, and he did say some really lovely things, and he loved people, and he cared for people, and he cared for people that society didn't care about. And all of those things are true. But there's more to Jesus than that. And James comes out with this completely revolutionary statement that basically says, you know, if you're in a humble position, if you're in a position where you maybe don't have enough, then you should consider yourself to be blessed. And actually, if you're not in that position, if you're rich, then look out, because actually your riches aren't really important to me. And if we take Jesus and really look at what he says, and really look at the whole ethos that he gave, and the whole way that he came to change everything and to turn everything upside down, then we have to consider that he's just far more than a really nice, kind, loving God who wants the best for us. All those things are true, but there is so much more. And James, you know, in just a few sentences puts those things out, and that's what we're looking at today, because I think that what we think we believe might not actually be kind of what we deep down believe, or what the fabric of our makeup would have us believe. And what we believe might not really actually spill over into how we act, and how we set our priorities, and how we live our lives. And there's some really easy questions that we can ask ourselves that will make us, that will give us a bit more understanding about what we actually do believe. And one of the questions is one that we probably, you know, when we could go to social gatherings and meet up with people, and maybe we met some new people, you know, back in the day when that was allowed. And one of the questions that we would be asked all the time would be things like, well, tell me about yourself. Not met you before, nice to meet me, nice to meet you, tell me about yourself. Well, here's how I used to answer that question, and I'm guessing that probably most of us used to answer that question something like this. So, tell me about yourself. Oh, well, I'm married. Been married for quite a long time, and I've got a couple of kids who are grown up now, and I've got a couple of grandchildren. And I'm fortunate enough to own my own house, actually. Yeah, live in my own house, and I used to be a civil engineer for years. I was a civil engineer for 25-30 years, and now I've got a job where I manage volunteers. That's how I answer the question, tell me about yourself. And I'm guessing that possibly most of us would answer that question something similar. So let's unpack that a little bit, and let's see Let's see what that means, because really how we answer that question is kind of based around what society's expectations of us are. So first of all, society expects to be able to put us in a box dependent on our relationships, dependent on our close relationships. So if we're married or we're in a long-term relationship, we go into a particular box and society thinks they know us because we're in that box. Or if we're divorced, we will go into a different box. And people will make assumptions. People will make assumptions because we're divorced. Or if we're single, another set of assumptions will be made and we'll go into a different box. Or if we're in a same-sex relationship, there'll be another box for us. Or if if we choose not to be defined by our gender, there'll be another box, and we will go into that box based upon what society has in their head around what that means. And then there's where we live. There's the stuff question. There's the stuff question. That's probably the one that is the most immediately apparent, actually, most of the time. So there'll be the, where do you live? What part of the country do you live in? What type of house do you have? What type of car do you drive? What clothes do you wear? What face cream do you use? Even down to stuff like that. Society will place a value on that. Society will place a value on your answer to that question about the stuff that is in your life, and you will get put in a box dependent on what your response is to that question. And that's before we even get onto what do you do for a living. So that's the other one, isn't it? What do you do? And what we actually mean is, what job have you got? And we've spent the last 12 months nearly actually understanding, being able to see, understanding that there is value in jobs that we never thought there was value in before. Delivery drivers, cleaners in hospitals, low paid care workers. We understand that there is value in that on this one level, on a cerebral level. We understand that our society can't operate without people that would do that kind of job. But I'm betting that even then, say we go back to those social situations when we're ever allowed to be in a social situation again, and there's a GP in the room, I'm betting most of us wouldn't say, oh, I've got this really nasty boil, do you fancy having a look at it while you're here? I bet most of us wouldn't do that. Whereas if there was a carpet fitter in the same social situation, we'd have no problem whatsoever in having a good old conversation about what's the best way to get around that tricky bit at the bottom of the stairs with my lino. We wouldn't have a problem discussing that, because we put different value as a society on different jobs, and it's ingrained in us. We have more respect actually for people that do some kind of jobs than for people that do other kind of jobs, even though up here in our heads, cerebrally, if you like, we understand that they are all of value. But when it comes to our attitude and our actions based upon that, I'm not so sure that for most of us it really sinks in. And James says here, none of that matters. None of that matters. And you see, the thing is, we've only talked so far about what society thinks of us. But what do we think of ourselves? What value do we place on ourselves? And I guess that even us that have been around church a long time, a lot of the value that we place upon ourselves will be, again, based upon what society thinks of us. And I wonder, if we looked back over the last week, how many hours have we spent doing things or acting in a particular way or working towards things just because we either want to fit into society or because we choose to stand out from society. But the things that we do, the stuff that we spend our time and our energy on, all around what is society going, what am I going to be thought of? What are people going to think of me? If I go out in my wellies to Morrison's, what are people going to think of me? If I buy nothing but Haribo sweets for my dinner, what are people going to think of me? If I exercise 3 times a week and eat a vegan only diet, what are people going to think of me? How much of our time and effort and energy is spent in trying to, even if we don't recognize it, but actually how much of our time and effort and energy is spent trying to fit into what society wants us to be like? And James says none of that is important at all. And the more time and effort and energy and money we are spending on those things, the more we are wasting our time. Because James says that the only thing that matters is what Jesus thinks of us. And the only standard that we should be living by is what Jesus thinks of us. And if we were to ask Jesus what he thinks of us, he would say things like, I love you. And he would say things like, I died for you. And he would say things like, you have the opportunity to be part of my family. You have the opportunity to be defined by being a child of the King, not by what society says of you. And maybe what James is saying, well, definitely what James is saying here is, if you're living your life, or part of your life, or bits of your life, trying to be defined by what society says you should be like, then you are wasting your time. And the only thing that matters is that you live defined by who Jesus says that you are. And when we live defined by who Jesus says we are, do you know what it is? Do you know what happens then? I'll tell you what happens then. It's blimmin' hard work. Because it is always hard work to fight against the tide. It's always far, far easier to fit in than it is to decide that you're going to live a different way. And if it wasn't hard work, James wouldn't have had to have said that whole thing that he says at the end about blessed is the man that has persevered. You know, we don't need to persevere if it's easy. If it was easy to live like Jesus wants us to live, if it was easy to make our priorities in line with what Jesus wants our priorities to be, we wouldn't have to persevere. It would be a doddle. It's far easier. It's far less of a struggle to make the choices, or to you don't even really have to make choices, do you, to fit in with society? It just happens. We have to persevere. We have to go through a trial to make choices that aren't those choices that society would want us to make choices about how we're going to spend our time, to make choices about how we're going to spend our energy, how we're going to spend our resources. It's hard work. It's hard work to do that. But what we get when we make those choices in line with what Jesus would think is important and what Jesus would think our priorities should be, then we get the crown of life. And in the end, it's all worth it. And in the end, our lives will have stood for something and will have made a difference. And my guess is that if more of us didn't just say that we believe that it doesn't matter whether we're rich or poor, but actually lived like it didn't matter whether we were rich or poor. My guess is that Jesus's fame and the knowledge of Jesus would be spread a hell of a lot further in our families and in our villages and in our towns and in our communities than it is at the moment. Last week, James encouraged us to pray, and it does all start with prayer. And a particular thing that James encouraged us to pray for last week was wisdom. So maybe this week we need to combine the two. Maybe we need to pray for wisdom, that Jesus would give us an insight into what his priorities for our lives are. And then maybe we should just go do it. I hope you have a really good week. I'll see you in a fortnight, and